David, so good to meet you. Thank you so much for spending a few minutes with us.
It's a pleasure to be here. Really great to meet you, Steve, and looking forward to a good discussion with you.
Well, thank you. So let's jump right into it. To begin with, would you please introduce Cadmium Global Solutions and your work with the United Nations?
Absolutely. So I am the head of risk as an advisor to the UN's Environment Program and their finance initiative in particular. So that means I work with financial institutions on measuring, managing, reporting on some of the consequences related to environmental topics like climate change and biodiversity. My role as the chief executive of Cambium Global Solutions really is to take that work a step further with organizations, governments, startups even, who are looking to embed sustainability in their strategy, looking to stay up to date on the latest reporting expectations, and really make this part of their new DNA as they move forward in our changing world.
Thank you. And just a second, would you share a little bit about why you actually care about sustainability?
So I think about sustainability in the very literal sense. Sometimes people, you say sustainability, they immediately think of the color green, they think of, trees. But when we really think about this from a human and a planetary perspective, sustainability is the ability to keep doing something on and on. And we talk about you're working 18-hour days. Well, that's unsustainable. You're a startup and you're burning too much capital and you're going to run out before your next funding round. That's unsustainable. And so fundamentally, what we have here is this need to think about our practices and say, can we keep doing what we're doing? And I think the answer from science, the answer from just observation in the world around us is no, we need to change those things. And so sustainability to me is about keeping this game going, about preserving in the best sense, conserving in the best sense, the things that are really critical, both in terms of human livelihood and well-being, and also the natural world that is not just ours to keep, but one that we pass on to future generations. And so seeing that as not only a environmental mission, but really one of societal responsibility is where I come from with that.
Thank you. And based on your work with your clients and with the United Nations, what reporting frameworks do you think are important, especially for people in the cleaning industry who are often just part of the supply chain with someone that's requiring reporting? So what are your thoughts?
So some of the big ones to be aware of come from first the IFRS Foundation, which is the International Financial Reporting Standards. And they created this board a couple of years ago called the International Sustainability Standards Board. And up to that point, there was a number of different reporting requirements, some of which still exist, others of which have been consolidated under their umbrella. But their work really has been to provide a global standard, both for sustainability more generally, so meaning both environmental and social factors, as well as climate specifically. And on that climate piece, some of your listeners may have heard about the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, or TCFD. That had probably become amongst the most popular climate-related disclosures over the last few years. The work of this International Sustainability Standards Board is going to fully take on the responsibilities of the TCFD when it comes to understanding and directing the quality of reporting. And of course, all of that then leads into regulatory requirements. And so those regulatory requirements will differ depending on where you're located. But there's been a very strong effort underway between the IFRS Foundation, between groups like the Global Reporting Initiative, and between national and international regulators to create correspondence, or what we call interoperability, between the standards. But I think as far as a good place to start, understanding the principles of the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures is very valuable for climate to see what the work is that is happening there, And then on sustainability, also looking at the work of the International Sustainability Standards Board. Of course, there are other frameworks, but I think those are helpful, and because of that correspondence, a worthwhile starting point.
Extremely helpful. Candidly, we're working right now on developing reporting platform for our members. So I appreciate you pointing out those reporting frameworks that you think are most important. And along with that, what trends are you starting to see? If you look in your crystal ball, where is all this going this year and into the future?
So I think we can talk about near-term trends and then maybe midterm trends. Of course, long-term futures are always uncertain, but if we think about over the next several months and perhaps even looking back on what we've seen, as regulators have picked up these standards, as these standards have been finalized, I think we're seeing a growing number of firms that are reporting. So if we look at the reporting requirements in different countries, what we see is often there's a phase-in based on size. So the SMEs typically will come a bit later than the larger and publicly traded firms. But what we're beginning to see is a greater quantity of disclosures being made, but also beginning to see greater standardization. And this is something that I very much expect to take off over the next several months ahead, which is now that there are regulatory expectations in place, we can't just do whatever we think the principles suggest. We begin to move toward a normalized standard of this is the information that's required. In the same way that while annual reports could be 50 pages, they could be 500 pages, there are going to be certain elements and markers within there that are going to be universally found. And I think we're starting to see that with sustainability. In the midterm, what I'm beginning to see discussions of and some early signals of is the integration of this into decision making. So as we engage our suppliers, as we engage our clients, we're beginning to see a little bit more of an expectation. Have you reported? What is your plan? And that can come in the sense of from governmental areas, so the directive from the federal government in the US around sustainable procurement, understanding what firms' vulnerabilities to climate change are, what their plans are, is one way to see that engagement. Another is for portfolio companies of investors and others to say, what are our goals and how is this company helping us reach them? So I think you're beginning to see, and you will continue to see over the midterm, more of that that impact on the disclosure and decision usefulness of those disclosures in particular.
And can you share any advice that you might have for companies or organizations just getting started on their sustainability journey?
Absolutely. And I would even recommend, even though it was written for a wide range of countries, I think the recommendations we make hold up. This is a piece of work we did with the UN on the use of the TCFD and that International Sustainability Standards Board, a getting started guidance. And it was, I believe, called Getting Started on reporting for emerging markets. But the specific pillars in there, the recommendations, that section, I think broadly holds up. And what it means is for getting started, a lot of times people look at what a large firm has done and say, oh, we could never do that, or we don't have the models, we don't have the people. And I think one of the recognitions, as I've spoken to many regulators and many supervisors, is there is an understanding of this proportionality. And so part of the goal is to understand what is relevant to you first, and then to calibrate one's efforts accordingly. And so your activities may be confined more geographically. Your activities may be confined to particular sub-industry or sub-business. That means that what you're going to see in a big aggregator report is not going to necessarily be necessary for you, but there are going to be elements in common. And this is where I think, fortunately, all organizations can get started relatively quickly. And that means starting at the top of the house. Who is responsible for sustainability at your firm? That is a question that may take some time to answer, but is not a question that requires huge amounts of analytical resources. It doesn't require models and estimates. It really requires a clarity of ownership. And I think that is one of the important first steps. The next is really saying, have we asked the right questions? We can begin with those questions qualitatively, and I think we'll get a lot of valuable answers from that, which is to say, how might these things matter to us? And we may identify risks that we wouldn't have otherwise thought of. And the benefit of that is we're doing double the amount of work for the same amount of effort. We're not only learning about our potential vulnerabilities from a strategic sense, but we're actually generating pieces that are going to be relevant for our report. And so a lot of the people that are starting out get hung up on the length of the report, on the use of scenarios, on the engagement of this or that carbon accounting. And those are all things that are going to need to happen over time, but they're not ones that are expected at the outset. And what that means is improvements in the data available for estimating emissions, improvements in the nature of your scenario analysis will take place over time. We can begin in very simple ways with top-line estimates. We can look at scenarios and ask, how might we be vulnerable to them without building a single model, without hiring someone to undertake that for us. We can also, at the same time, on the emissions, begin to get a rough profile by thinking about our size relative to peers, thinking about the activities we do. And while that's not going to be perfect, it's going to give us that first kind of back of the envelope estimate that will really be helpful in the years ahead as we begin to both set goals and we begin to really get specific. But I think a lot of times the biggest mistake is trying to make the leap. And often that leap, fortunately, is not a necessary one.
And I suspect as people start looking at their data and where they're starting from, that they'll also give them an opportunity to identify opportunities for reducing waste, for driving efficiencies, which ultimately lead to financial savings as well.
I think that that's absolutely true. And this, if we begin to change our mentality about sustainability, I think we begin to see it for what it is, which is also a huge opportunity. Right now, I think a lot of effort and concern has been justly focused on the compliance costs on the reporting side. And that's understandable, but I think that is the limited mentality. The unlimited mentality is one of starting with these changes are taking place. The people that I work with, consumers as well as corporations, are changing their preferences. The regulations governmentally are changing to shift things. The areas around us on just the physical basis are beginning to change. And how do I stay ahead of that? And if you begin to think of this as related to, but perhaps even bigger than the shift, say, to online business, or you think about the shift to globalization, these are fundamental moves that are not just trends, that are not just fads, but that are pervasive new ways of operating. And if you get out ahead of those, you can have some of that first mover advantage. So right now, I think we're seeing kind of a bit of the costs of that in terms of the reporting. But the way that is best done is that the reporting, ironically, actually really comes at the end of this process. And so I think what we'll find is firms that are further along in their thinking will also find themselves having an easier time with the reporting because they're not going to have to double back around to say, hey, what is our strategy on this? But rather, we can just document it. And of course, in all other lines of business, reporting happens after you've done things, not prospectively to doing them.
Thank you. And finally, do you have any additional thoughts that we haven't really addressed that you'd like to share?
So maybe just as a concluding thought, as I mentioned the scale and scope of the opportunity, I would also say it's easy to be limited in terms of both thinking of the risks and opportunities. Some people think of climate change and they think of sea level rise. Some people think of environment and they think of pollution and chemicals. But what I would say is begin to think expansively. Start with an understanding of what all of these different changes are and think in a systematic way. It may not be your activities. It may be those that are upstream of you. It may be the suppliers to you. It may be, if you're a supplier, the requirements you're getting downstream. But recognizing, where do these things intersect with our business? And you won't find that all of them do, but what you will find is that the diversity is a lot higher. And when we've seen people get into trouble kind of missing the key elements, whether it was in the global financial crisis or now with climate, it's seeing one problem while another is sneaking up on you. And I think that getting that 360-degree view doesn't involve the exhaustive analysis. It involves taking the first look, kind of peeking one's head up around and saying, oh, okay, climate also is going to be about water availability. It's going to be about energy use. It's also going to be about policy and legislation. And once we begin to say that, we become less likely to get caught unawares.
David, you're awesome. Thank you very much for spending a few minutes with us. It is really greatly appreciated. Thank you.
You're most welcome, Steve, and really a pleasure to be here. And I wish you and the entire organization all the best.